All right, so this one is obtaining the best harvest. And the best is subjective. So the question is what makes a harvest the best? I say the best harvest is a harvest that's there year round, because the whole concept of harvesting means I went out and I got a whole bunch of stuff and I brought it to another place and now it has to be stored. Okay, so now it needs to go in the fridge, or, which is running 24/7, sucking up energy, using things. Then there's that whole idea of drying it. So there's a lot of energy that's wasted drying it and putting it up. And I'm not saying that it's wasted. I did say that, but I don't really mean wasted. But I mean used. You're using energy, and it's an accounting here. You've got to account for the energy that you've used to take this material and make it usable for a long term, or storable in this case. And then there's seeds and beans and things that can just be dried, and they can sit and sit and sit for years. I've grown beans that were in a pot in a packet for 20 years. And then they put them in the ground and I got almost 90% germination. I mean, that's really, really good for that kind of time. So the best harvest would be how to get it so that every time you walk out to your garden, there's plenty of food to eat. So you can pick it fresh and walk back into the house and eat it versus storing it somewhere and using a refrigerator. And food preservation notwithstanding, and natural refrigeration and zero energy storage and all that notwithstanding, I'm talking about how to get a harvest to go from as many months as possible. And here in Florida, we can have food growing in our garden year round, absolutely year round. So in the meeting this morning when we were talking about how to put together a really good garden, we had talked about different spinaches. So just to use spinach as an example, there's a bunch of perennial spinaches like Okinawan spinach, there's Moluccan spinach, there's Ethiopian kale, which is considered a spinach. There's chaya. There are all these different spinaches, and what you end up with is something that grows well in the summer. But then in the winter time, there are all the different varieties of annual winter spinaches, the ones that won't grow in the heat. So all you have to do is make sure that you have them planted before the summer ones go out. Plant the winter ones. And then as the summer ones begin to go to flower, the winter ones start picking up, and you have food, and you never have missed a beat. That's just one example of just crossing over different varieties of plants. The nice thing about the perennial ones that I mentioned about that grow in the summer is that those perennial ones will actually, you don't even ever have to replant those. You just come back next spring, and as it starts to heat up, they start popping back out of the ground again, and they're fine. So that's one way. Then there's another way of having varieties where you have, like, say, mulberries that fruit early, and mulberries that start in the middle of the year, and mulberries that fruit late. And so you have mulberries that are fruiting all year long. A lot of them have edible leaves, and a lot of them have fruit. And I'd say, we try to concentrate on the ones that actually give off fruit. Because you can eat the edible leaves great, but it's always good to have the fruit for just another variety. Then we want to talk about fruit trees. So when I first put in a garden, the first thing I do is I figure out where all of my little fruit trees can go, because they're going to take a while to get going, and they're going to take a while to fruit and start giving me produce. So I put nuts for protein and bread and flour. A lot of trees also have edible leaves, so you will drop those in. Then there are the fruiting trees. Fruiting trees give you apples, the plums, and mulberries, and peaches and pears and whatnot. And some of those have edible leaves. Then you're going to have the olive trees, and olive trees give you the oils. They give you fuel. Some people make olive oil and light it in candles and light it in little oil lamps. Not candles, but oil lamps. You can run your car on olive oil if you have enough olives. The idea is to plant these plants first and then start worrying about the annuals and other gardens in the middle. So, how to obtain the best harvest? When you have different varieties of a plum, think of it this way. We have plum trees that are native to Florida, and they never give off a lot of fruit, but they give off consistent fruit. And they don't blossom until it gets really hot. And this is part of the reason you don't get a lot of fruit on them, because they don't blossom very early, and it gets pretty cold late. So they got this short window of time, but you're always going to get some kind of fruit off of them. Then you have the Chickasaw plum, which is actually the closest to our native, but it's a cultivar. That cultivar will actually bloom early, and it will bloom pretty well and give you fruit, and by the end of the season you have a load of fruit. Now, here's where you get in that best harvest thing. Now, let's say we have a very late freeze. and all those blossoms are frozen and fall off the Chickasaw plum. You're not going to get any fruit off that Chickasaw plum. And all the farmers will be wringing their hands and cursing. And you know what? If you planted some native ones, you'd have half the crop. So have the natives and the cultivars together. We're calling that food security. So you end up with some plums at the end of the year no matter what. There's a chance you can get massive amounts, but there's a good chance you're just going to get a half amount. But if you only plant the one, you're only going to have none, okay, if the weather doesn't work your way. So it's important that you plant a little bit of everything. So there are different varieties of all these trees that will help you to plant your plants and get something. But here's another thing to look at, microclimates. Say we do, because we're having a lot of climate instability these days. Say we do have a crazy, wacky freeze that happens, because technically it could still happen this year. I mean, highly unlikely, but it's been known to happen in the past, that you'll have freezes in March. Oh, that's right, it's already April. So hopefully we're past that. But say we're in March, you could have a freeze. You could lose all your blossoms, you could lose all your fruit. But say you had a microclimate, we call it a sun trap or a sun scoop. And what we do is we have a bunch of material, it could even just be trees that are growing, plants and bushes and shrubbery, that are open to the south. Because the southern winter sun will come across here, heat up the mass, and radiate all night. And you have your real weak plants on the inside, the real cold intolerant plants on the inside of that scoop. What happens is the sun comes in and it heats the entire area, but it holds it overnight. That keeps these plants from freezing, and then you do have your blossoms, and then you do have a massive amount of food. But people complain it takes up a lot of space to make these scoops. Well, that's true. Well, all of that could be food too. You should never be saying, I'm a farmer and I farm this one crop, because that's the most unhealthy way to grow food. It's also the most unstable, and it's the worst business investment I can think of. So you have to have a polyculture of foods built into systems that make everybody happy. All the plants need to be happy. So when I plant my fruit tree, just one, there's a way that we prepare the ground. There's a way that we prepare its future growth. Not just I'm putting it in here now and it's going to fend for itself after the first year or two. I'm going to prepare for its future growth. I'm talking about the 5-year mark. And once I've prepared it for that, that tree is going to be huge, it's going to keep growing, and then we're going to have a polyculture planted around it, because that's step 2. Step 2 of planting a fruit tree is immediately plant the polyculture. So we're talking about understory plants. Plant the comfrey and yarrow and tansy, and these plants drill deep down into the earth and bring moisture back up. And when their leaves slough off, they actually drop the minerals that they get from deep underground and all the things that they've harvested out of the air. We're talking about nitrogen and whatnot. And they drop that on the ground at the base of the plants that they're near. And they make it all available to the surface plants. So even plants that don't have deep roots get to have all of these great resources because these other plants went and got them for them. And we call those plants nurse plants or just dynamic bioaccumulators. So once I've planted those plants, people go, well, what can you do with them? Well, each one of those plants is a highly medicinal plant that we could spend an hour alone talking about. But what I'm going to go into now is the other plants. You don't want grass to come in, because grass actually will compete for the top resources that the tree wants. The tree eats from its roots that are growing across the top of the ground. The roots that go deep down into the ground are looking for water. Those are 2 separate root systems, and they do 2 separate jobs. If grass comes in here and competes, that'll cause a problem. So a lot of nurseries say just scrape all the grass away and leave it bare. Nature doesn't want anything to be bare. So the minute you've created bare spots on your land, you're constantly fighting weeds and diseases and other issues. So what you need to do is surround that tree with the allium family plants. Onions, garlic, chives, society garlic counts, any bulbing flower. And if you can think of bulbing flower, that's the one, like I think, John, bulbing flowers.
Amaryllis, daylilies.
Daylilies is one I was going to say. What's the one that starts with a G?
Gladiola.
There you go. I always forget those. Gladiolas. Get those flowers in there. I mean, they're going to, thank you. They're going to attract, and you too. They're going to attract all the insects that come. And when they come to pollinate the flowers, they're going to see the blossoms on your tree, and they're going to pollinate your tree too. And so what you've done is you've used this twofold step of a pretty flower, which is pretty. We like seeing them. It brings the insects in, and it also stops the advancement of grass. And because now you have a closed canopy, any rain that comes down is not going to evaporate out. So it's all being taken advantage of by the soil underneath the tree. Now what I'm doing here is I've created moisture. Water is life. And now the water and the moisture and the subterranean life get together and they do their thing. Next thing you know, the tree's got this constant source of water. It grows markedly faster and better. Okay, now we're not looking for fast growth. We're looking for fast, natural growth. Not like, I grew this tree in 2 hours. You know, that doesn't make sense. Okay, that's not nature. But once we have all that stuff happening, once we have the soil building and we have the moisture being retained and withheld, and then we have our little understory plants that bring in the insects and basically lay down an ecosystem, you can also put certain bushes and shrubs underneath the fruit tree, and those bushes and shrubs help out a lot too. What you end up with is an ecosystem that you can walk away from. And now I can come back here at any time, especially if I've planted the right onions. I can be picking onions any time of the year. I can be picking garlic pretty much any time of the year, because there's different varieties of garlic too. You know, there's a wild garlic that right now, and a wild onion that right now is popping up out of the ground along the sides of roads. Well, those could be growing in your little garden here. And those were free, okay? So what's another thing to think about? The best harvest. Now, when I go and get a carrot out of the ground, okay, we're gonna talk about a different thing, and I clean it off, and I chop the greens off so I can juice them. I make my juice, right? Or I chop the greens off to feed to the bunnies or the chickens. You see how the bunnies and the chickens are getting good food, right? That's important. If I chop the root off, put that in my salad or whatever, juice that, I've got that little bit that people usually throw away. Well, what happens if I just stick that down in my beautiful, moist, amazing soil? It immediately grows into another carrot, okay? And it's actually, in my opinion, it's easier to grow carrots that way than it is from seed, because they're very, you know, touchy little seeds. Turnips, rutabagas, sweet potatoes, regular potatoes. Go down the list of plants that are root plants. Celery, oh yeah, celery is a great one. I've got 2 celeries growing right now that came from an early harvest. So as I harvest my own plants, I put the plant back in. That's a best harvest technique. Now think of this one as well. A tomato pops out or a pepper pops up, the first one of the year. Those are really good, you know, I think about this. That plant gave me fruit immediately, so I want those seeds. I want those seeds to be in my garden because they're fast. I also want the seeds that are last, because the seeds that are last took their time. The plant that gave me fruit last took its time, got past the freezes, you know what I mean? I want those too, and maybe a few in the middle. So I'm selectively pulling seeds off these plants so I can have just good, resilient plants. But when I put one seed in the ground, I get hundreds of seeds out of that plant, hundreds, and you don't usually eat those. People usually throw that stuff away, even though they are edible, but people usually do throw those away. People scoop out the middle of the tomato and make tomato sauce. Well, all that's sitting there ready to be fermented into the next year's batch of tomatoes, or even this year's batch of tomatoes later in the season. So there's another way of looking at that. So we're planting the tomato seeds and the pepper seeds, and we're keeping things moving. So now we've got proper varieties, we've got microclimates, and we've got how to take the produce that you've already pulled out of the garden or even from a grocery store and plant it in the ground. Celery was that last one. You just take the bottom of the celery off, stick it in the ground, new celery plant, like nothing happened. Tastiest stuff you've ever had right out of the garden. Celery is not celery until you've had it out of your garden. Yeah. So there are a ton of these things. And another nice thing is sweet potatoes, you can eat the greens, and a lot of people don't realize that. In Southeast Asia, that's all they do is eat the greens. And they think it's funny that we eat the potato part. But it's, you know, it's just to each his own, right? But you put those in the ground and they make great ground cover. So they're actually something that won't compete for certain resources for some plants, and they make great ground cover. They go well with banana trees. Banana tree is a grass, just so you know. Their root, there's no taproot, it's all like this, and it's an herb. So when you put sweet potatoes and cassava and things like that around a banana tree circle, they don't compete. It seems like they would, but they don't. And they seem to be, they work a lot, work well together a lot. So, and we could talk about banana circles separately, because if you want to get bananas in Florida, you do need to put them in a southern brick wall, so that the early part of the season, they start getting heat faster when everything else is still kind of cold. And then they stay hot longer towards the end of the season, because the sun's always hitting that wall, soaking up the heat and radiating it at the plants. But that wall should also be taking in any kind of wastewater from, say, an AC unit. All that condensation can constantly drip into your banana tree circle. And you want to throw all your kitchen scraps and make sure with kitchen scraps you put brown carbon, like hay, like leaves. Just keep bags of leaves that fell, you know, during the winter or the spring, and take all those and just drop them in there. that can slowly but surely build very beautiful humic soil. And these banana trees will show you how happy they are in the fact that they're going to throw out lots of fruit. And you're liable to get fruit right here in Florida with any old variety, not even just the ones that we grow specifically here. Dwarf Cavendish are good because they can stay small. And when they're small, they can absorb more heat from that wall, because a lot of bananas will grow way taller than your house. So again, it's variety, it's microclimates, it's how to harvest what you pull out of the garden and or out of the grocery store, because all that stuff will grow here for the most part. And it's how to plant the perennial fruiting trees and the perennial plants so that you always have food when you come back out to your garden. Can anybody think of anything else that I might be missing? Some of my PDC graduates here in the front. Am I missing anything?
The companion planting.
Well, it is, yeah, let's talk about that. So it is good to have in your one little garden, like in my garden, I have garden beds that are the size of this for the most part. I don't put lumber up, I don't put the plank boards. I just let it all, I just dig a hole, it's a pit garden, fill it with organic matter, and then plant it for years without ever watering, without ever fertilizing. And what I ultimately end up with is humus that is very stable and sucks up rainwater like a sponge. And so when it rains, I have all that water in there. This is why I never have to water. Now I do tell people, if you walk out into your garden and at 8 o'clock in the morning before the sun's up, your plants are looking droopy, you do need to water those plants. And preferably it's with rainwater capture, because rainwater improves the soil where city water actually damages the soil. City water will grow plants, but they won't be as happy ever as if you're using rainwater. So the polyculture that we're talking about, you don't just throw everything together just because. You think of companion planting or guild planting. Permaculture people call it guild. And what we do is we put plants that mechanically make sense and or just make logical sense. When I put in something that flowers around a fruiting tree and it holds back the grass, I've got two good things happening there. Well, two that we'll talk about right now. The grass is stopped because I've got closed canopy happening. Okay, but it's also bringing in the insects to pollinate the tree. But at the same time, it's food, so that's 3. And then 4th, it's building soil because it's holding moisture down in the soil. 5, it's giving you oxygen. I mean, you can start making this list of things that makes one plant amazing, much less what a tree does, which could fill volumes of books. So now we've got specific polyculture. So in one small place, I'm growing a lot of plants that don't compete. So now I'm getting that harvest as well. I'm getting the fact that I've got sweet potatoes, onions, what's a deep plant that's very edible? I mean, borage is a very edible plant. It's also insectiary, likes the cold. You can get nasturtiums in there that are considered a blood tonic, very tasty and radishy. There's, I'm growing, let me think, this Thai pepper. It's a Thai hot pepper. It grows up out of the ground, freezes in the winter, comes right back in the summer. I never have to replant it. That's a plant. I love those kind of plants because you just leave your yard alone and you plant your winter annuals, and then you wait for the summer staples to come popping out of the ground after the freezes. So now we've got polyculture, microclimates, varied varieties that are for the whole season, and that's about it. But as far as getting a good harvest, to me, a good harvest is about being able to walk out into my yard at any time of the year and pop plants and vegetation out of the yard and eat that food. Feed your bunnies and your rabbits and your people and everybody on this food. And leave plenty for the wild animals. There will be plenty. I do want to go over one thing about propagation. And I'll leave you guys with the propagation. On the perennial plants, like let's just talk about Okinawan spinach. It grows almost like a vine. And every 6 inches of that vine, and even smaller, but I like to go 6 inches to be sure, if I cut that and I pull the leaves, maybe leave one leaf on each section, and I stick that on the ground, not only do I have a nice, what do they call it, sauteed spinach. You put a little bit of butter and garlic in there, and butter and garlic makes everything taste good. But if I put a little butter and garlic in with that spinach leaves, and I have my meal, I've also harvested about 5-6 plants that I can stick in the ground next to that plant. And in about 1 month, I'll have 6 or 7 more plants. And the next time I go out there to eat spinach, I do it again and again. And eventually I have so much spinach, I have to give it away to get rid of it. But then I've got literally so much food as I eat. So as we eat, we should be creating more food. And certain plants help us do that. And this is the difference between annuals and perennials. Annuals give us lots of seeds, and it's a wonderful thing. but perennials stay in the ground and propagate in the same season. I can propagate more and more and more of them. So in permaculture, we like to stick with as many perennials as we can and grow the annuals as a hobby. It's a little side thing. Grow the annuals in and around your perennials for taste. But most importantly, what you guys should think about is find foods that you don't get in the grocery store. Because foods in the grocery store are grown for the fact that they can be picked unripe, they'll ripen on the trip, they have thick walls, or they store well, or they don't wilt. These are the foods that are picked for their mechanical reasons, the fact that they can physically take a beating. That doesn't necessarily mean it's high in nutrition or even high in flavor. And generally what's happened, at least since the 70s, since I was a little kid, I can tell the difference in food, big time. What we need to do is start growing varieties of foods that we don't even recognize. Things that we can put in the soil that can pop up out of the ground at any point and give us amazing food that we can't get in the grocery store that is grown for nutrition. Some foods, like look at figs. Figs are really only really ripe, same with loquats, for about a week. I mean, you can eat them, but they're really tasty and really ripe for about a week. And that's when you're battling the birds for them.
Yeah.
But there's ways to put little screens around whole branches and you can get all those figs. It's not a big problem. Loquats, they can be really tasty, and for about 3 days, they're so good that kids will turn up candy for those things. Oh, give me the loquat any day. And that's what you want to grow for. Flavor, ripeness, 15 seconds out of the backyard instead of 1,500 miles and 15 days in a grocery store. You want 15 seconds, ripe and healthy, loaded with nutrition, and ready to go anytime you need it. And that's how we plant our gardens. Does anybody have any questions about any of this stuff? Okay. All right.
Blackberry vines, how do you reproduce blackberry vines? Do you cut the new growth, or you pull up a root, or
Are you talking about the wild native vines that we have?
like thornless blackberries?
Oh, thornless blackberry, you can make cuttings, and out of just blackberry,
The new growth?
the new growth, you take those cuttings and you strip all but a few leaves off of it. Anytime you do a transplant or a cutting, you want to strip most of the leaves off because it's going to try to support those leaves. And you want it to drive its energy back into root making. So pop all that off and leave it concentrating on roots. But you stick that blackberry vine in, and a lot of times I'll scrape a little of the outer bark off of woody things and stick it in the ground at the very bottom. Stick it in the ground. If it's good, beautiful soil that you've been cultivating, it'll take off like nothing. If it's potting soil, you might have to add a little rooting hormone. You might have to add a little bit more compost to get that to happen. But the idea is to get it in there and get those roots going. But a lot of plants will propagate like that. And then there's dewberry, which is our wild blackberry, which doesn't have as many seeds as the cultivar blackberry, but it grows wild and it doesn't necessarily fruit. And what you need to know about this plant is if you hack it back wildly, just treat it like it's done something wrong, right? And keep whacking it back. When it starts growing back in the spring, it's going to flower like a fiend. Every single part of this plant's going to be a little white blossom ready to make you new fruit. And I've proven this year after year. If you even damage part of it, every place it's crawled under the ground and it's popping up near a fence will start flowering. The whole plant, everywhere it exists, will start flowering. It knows it's in distress. And this is another thing you have to know about plants is if you distress them, they're liable to give you more fruit. So that means if I'm out there picking them or browsing off of them all the time, giving them love, it's love to us, to them. It's like, what are you doing? It'll actually give you more fruit because it's hoping something will eat its seeds and take it away from you. It says, take me away from here. And if you hack back your herbs, a lot of the perennial herbs, same thing with basil. Take a chunk of basil like that, strip off the leaves, put that in the spaghetti, stick that in the ground, new basil plant every time. They're very easy to propagate. So these perennial plants, they're trying to get away from you. They want to put out the seeds, they want to put out fruit, they want to be able to or the annuals. They want to be able to get out of that area because there could be a problem. That's why a lot of plants like tomatoes, if you give them too much nitrogen, they don't make blossoms and they don't make fruit. They got everything they need. Hey, I'm living here in Club Med, I don't need to do any work. But the minute you put them in a spot where they kind of need to go looking for some food, they'll start flowering. Sometimes you even chop them back a little bit and watch them freak out. They'll double their size and they'll start putting off a lot of blossoms. So just start watching your plants. Let your weeds grow. Let a few weeds grow here and there around the borders. They're very beneficial to your plants. They are companions like you've never seen. And study what each and every one of them is. Most of them are very medicinal or edible and are very necessary for your good, healthy life if you're going to start living in a garden. Don't eradicate all your weeds. Just outcompete them. That's all we're asking. Is there any other questions about anything?
Predator bugs.
What's that?
Predator bugs.
Predator bugs. Okay, let's talk about bugs for a second here. So watering your plants is bad for your plants. Did you know that? People go, well, it rains and the plants get watered, so that's like watering. I'm just pretending like I'm a rainstorm. If you're pretending like you're a rainstorm, then you have to wait until the clouds come over. Do you see how it just happened? And the temperature lowers and your plants go dormant. Then you can start watering, okay? Now, it's also good to only water the area around the plants because you want the roots to go for the water, because more roots are more drought tolerant plant. That way, when you're not watering them, and you're not going to be, you'll actually have roots from these plants that span greater areas because you didn't water right at the root ball, but you watered around it and made it sniff out the water. So that's what happens when a rainstorm comes by. It puts the plants in a dormant state, the rain comes down, and then the plants go out and get it the next day, because usually it's in the evening. You know, the rain comes in the evening, and then all night it's soaking in. The next morning they're dry and they're ready to go for that water. They go and get it. If I'm watering in the middle of the day, all of these plants are drooping, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, my plants are drooping, I've got to water them. So they stop drooping because it looks like they're dying. They're trying to get out of our sun. We have a lot of sun. And now I'm forcing them to open up their pores and transpire the water out, or they're going to drown. And we don't want them to drown, and they don't want to drown. So now they're sitting there open, making photosynthesis because the sunlight's going into those pores. And now they're growing big and green and lush, and we think that's really good. And the fruit's getting really big and juicy looking, and we think that's really good. But what's happening is it's becoming watery. It's not nearly as flavorful or as nutritious as it could be. And the plant's big and green, but now it's more weak, and the insects start coming for it. Now when the insects start coming for your plants, the next thing you're going to do is get an organic pesticide. And I do this because it's still not good for you. But we have an organic pesticide that we spray, or some pepper spray or something, and now we're fighting insects, which means we're doing extra work and it's unnecessary. But what ends up happening is we kill off the predatory insects. And those predatory insects come after the insects that eat your plants. But when I kill all the insects in my garden, those guys are gone too, and it takes them a long time to come back. But what happens is I'm also ruining the soil because I'm damaging the soil's balance with pesticides and herbicides and whatever. And now the plant's even weaker. And now more insects are coming, and there's nothing to stop them except me. And now I'm out there spraying and spraying and spraying, trying to keep these insects off my plants and wondering what's going wrong. And what actually happened, what really went wrong was I'm watering them. That's a problem. So when we build our plant systems, we're building pit gardens, we're loading them up with wood way down in the bottom, we're putting branches, and we're putting leaves and a little bit of soil, putting kitchen scraps, a little coffee grounds. We're trying to create a huge compost pile, and then we top it off with about 6 to 8 inches of soil, and then we plant into that, and the roots go for what they want, but they're high and dry. When a flood comes by and there's a lot of rain, it goes and soaks into the material underneath, but the plants are still high and dry and they get what they want. They don't drown. That's important. Because here in Florida, you know, you can drown your plants real easily if you're not raised, right? So there you go. Keep everything completely natural. Let nature handle it. Put in big sponges of organic matter and grow on those. Let the plants have their time, and don't water them, especially not in the middle of the day. I say if you got to water something, water early in the morning or late in the afternoon when the sun's pretty much out of their face, and then water them. And then they're going to be happy. And please water with rainwater. Is there any other questions about any of that? Oh, anything else?
What if you already have an area that's dug up for a garden? I mean, I hand dug it, and I didn't rototill it, but I hand picked all the weeds out of it, and so now I've got all this bare dirt.
Well, you'll never get rid of the weeds.
Tomatoes and peppers and
Yeah.
so did I ruin that by digging that up?
What you're going to have to do is, because soil never likes to be bare. Did I already say that today? Yeah.
That's why I'm asking.
And the weeds are going to come back no matter what. And even if you lay down weed barrier, if anything hits the top of the weed barrier, the weeds are going to grow out of that.
Well, what I usually do is I lay cardboard down. I put like a soaker hose under it and cardboard on the top and wet it all down, and then I put mulch on it. That's not good.
That's probably the best way to do that, but you're still using water that you don't need to do, and you have to take care of these plants. And it's still putting a lot of excess water that they may or may not want.
So what do you do before you dug this up?
If I were going to say do anything, I would say start planting perennials around the garden.
In with the tomatoes, you have
That's right.
squash and all that.
Plant your perennials. Take care of the perennials and get those going. And there are a bunch of things that can be perennial. I mean, and if you come to our meetings at Permaculture Jacks, yes, thank you. Then you can swap for perennials. Just tell them what you're looking for before you come, or people might not bring anything. That's the, you know. But if people know that you're looking for something and you've got something to trade or you don't, it doesn't matter. Ask for stuff. Just throw it out there and it comes to you. Yeah. So we have plenty of plants to trade. But what you need to do, what you need to know right now is mulch is king. You just keep it mulched really well, and then next season when all these plants are gone, dig it out a little bit, throw some material down in the ground. And by the way, study your soil. When you dig down even 3 inches, if that looks like subsoil, this is what we're trying to avoid. I want, like in my yard, I can dig 18 inches, 2 feet down, and I'm still finding black, beautiful, humic soil with soil structure. And that's because of how I've done this.
Behind this area, I started like the Hugel thing.
Mhm.
Dug a big ditch. I thought that would surround the outside of it. Now I just have to find logs. You know, every log I can find is just cut, so it's not
Well, out in the ditch, logs in the ditch are really good. Logs at
really go to the ditch.
rotten logs in the park, usually they're sitting there. But you know what I usually tell people is wait for yard waste day. Because my next door neighbors just threw out a nice big batch of rotty branches. I just grabbed those and put them in a garden somewhere. Yeah, yeah.
I restored this a couple years ago. These arches right here,
Uh-huh.
flat. But I'm trying to actually kill, what's growing on these arches right here. I restored it and everything, but we still have this built in 1932.
Right,
So it's just hard to kill these, growing.
right.
That's
So,
what I call it, what I have.
so what's happening is nature's putting these beautiful little weeds in here to it found a little place where moisture is going to stay, and it says, hey, something needs to be growing here. And so he's trying to keep stuff from growing in it. But what you end up with in a situation like this is a chemistry experiment, because this is a man-made project and we've made it all rough looking. The only other thing I could say is to smooth it out. Well, see how it's been made to be, and you're not going to do that on a historical or a monument. But what you have right now are places where moisture and dust out of the air can settle and create a little bit of soil, and it grows a plant, and that plant grows into your structure and makes it worse. If you smooth that out with stucco, nothing will stick, or very little.
Going out from both tops.
Yeah.
Demoed them all the way down.
It has everything to do with the actual form of the surface.
Inside that is coal.
Coal, huh?
Put coal inside it and then bricked it.
Very nice. So yeah, the only thing you can do is either get up there and manually remove it or change the shape of it. Yeah, I wish there was an easier answer, but yeah.
Do you ever go visit a yard to give an opinion? Do you ever go visit a yard to
site
give an
visit.
opinion?
A site
We do that as a whole community sometimes. Yeah. So if you've come into our community and you go and help us build systems and places, you're going to learn so much. But then you're also making face value with all these people. And you say, hey, everybody, come over to my house. And they'll go, yeah, let's do it. And then they go over to your house.
Because I am just now in the stages of
We think it's important that people come and help us, not just because we are into reciprocant giving, because that's not really the case. But what we found is if people come and put the time in, they're liable to stay a part of the community, and they'll value what we do when we put it in their place, and they'll even understand it better, and they'll even know how to use it going forward better than if they show up and say, hey, I want a garden, and we go, yes, because trust me, I did that for years. And I don't know where those people are today because, because they did, yeah, and they probably didn't even, because they didn't come back, they didn't learn anymore. They just basically wandered away and said, this thing isn't growing because they didn't know what to do. And it died off. Now, I have heard a few people have actually kept theirs going, and that's wonderful. And as a matter of fact, when I talked to the 4-H club, I showed them how to do ring gardens around trees, and they went on and did about 30 other gardens. And so, yeah, I mean, that's what I would love to see, is all of us go and start our own thing, doing what we know works, and put those gardens in as many places as possible.
So now, you're doing one around here, is that true? Lakeshore? Or
Oh, there's 2 right there in that yard, in the Nelson's yard. So I'll show you where those are when we're done here. Yeah, and as a matter of fact, I'll show you how the one that we hugelkultured, we conditioned the soil. They had already planted the trees and they were looking like they were going to die. So the one on the left, we did all of our treatment to, and we did hugelkulture around it, and we planted it with an ecosystem. and we walked away from it. We didn't do the other one because we didn't have time in that day. Here it is about 2 months later, I want to say, and the one that we didn't do has maybe a few little buds of leaves coming out. The other one is loaded with leaves and blossoms and ready to go. So then we just we did the one on the right and conditioned it all up and got it ready, and we'll see how they both turn out in the long run. But it was nice to see those two same trees in the same yard and the same slope. We took care of one and watched it explode into life, and the other one's still struggling, and now we've conditioned it. So we'll see how that turns out.
Let me tell you a story about mulch. I've got a backyard full of Florida sand like most people.
Yeah, still.
A couple years ago, I started taking my grass clippings when I mow my yard and putting them in a pile. 2 years later, we used the grass on top to put on top of a hugel, but I've now got 6 inches of topsoil under that sand, full of worms.
This area that I dug up for the garden, I've been putting chips on, wood chips and bark and whatever. I just kept it covered, cardboard, all that. And now it's very pliable. But I did dig the whole darn thing up.
Right.
And now I know.
Well, you know, you should once you put a system in like this, if you feel like you've done it right, you should never go back in there again
Right.
until, say, it stops producing food, and then it's time to go and try something else. But for the most part, they should last 15 years. I mean, it should last at least 5 years.
My goal.
And so far, I've gone 3 years, and it's been fine. 3 going on 4. But if you plant a forest system, it's going to continue to grow, and you should never have to go back in there because the ecosystem that you've put in takes care of itself.
Let me ask you this. What if you have a septic system with drain fields? Do you need to be careful what you plant around, or is there anything? Because I know water-loving things will get into those
Yeah.
systems.
Septic tanks, because they're not natural or strange, I tell people to switch to compost and then plant it up so you're not using it anymore and you're not worried about it, composting toilets so that you're not worried about it. Try to figure out how to do gray water legally if you can, because if you can do gray water, then now all of a sudden your water is working twice fold for you, which is especially good.
Gray water, not by choice, because
Yeah.
my laundry is separate from the sewer, or from the big tank.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that little tank probably doesn't exist anymore, and it has like a big pipe, so the water comes out the top, but I just let it water down, and I'm gonna plant.
Well, you could plant all kinds of flowers and let it be bee forage, and put a little bench in there and an umbrella, and just use that as your open space.
The city probably won't like that, but as long as I don't sell the house, I'm okay.
Right. Yeah, a lot of what we have set up is a maintenance nightmare on an ongoing basis. And so in permaculture, the idea is that we create things that don't ever need to be touched again. And you can handle all of your water that way. You can handle your electricity that way. I mean, for the most part, electricity, solar panels need to be touched every 30 years or so. Touched as in, updated. But 30 years, come on, You'll probably change them out before then anyway, so you can get smaller ones that do 5 times the work, is the way I look at it.
Well, now, do you have sources for like wood chips?
Yes.
By the way, I'm told that wood chips bring termites, so like you're
No.
going, or if they're green, they'll pull the nitrogen and burn the plants
No.
around them as they decompose. Not true?
No. First of all, I wouldn't personally put wood chips on my garden.
Yeah.
That's not what I
I'm
consider a
talking
mulch.
about like in-
Paths.
Yes, paths.
Yep.
that's what
You can let them, see, there's no nitrogen in that soil anyway.
No, it's just
So when they break down, they do suck nitrogen from their surroundings, but they're going to get it mainly from the air because there's nothing in our soil as far as nitrogen is concerned. And so what happens is over time, once it's finished breaking down, it releases the nitrogen back. So it's worth the wait. And it doesn't take 6 months for some of this stuff to break down and become coffee grounds underneath the ground.
you have a source for that.
Oh, sure. And you want wood chips.
Back over there.
You want wood chips that are entire trees. You want to have the leaves, the branches, the outer bark, the inner bark, the outer wood, the inner wood. All of that stuff needs to be in your wood chip mulch. But what you want to mulch your garden with is things like hay and straw and pine straw and stuff like that. And cardboard is fine. I just don't feel like introducing anything else that may be like man-made and acidic. And people go, well, pine chips are acidic, but pine straw is acidic, but it's really not that acidic. And because trust me, if you try to just use pine straw to get a blueberry to get to the acid levels it takes to blossom, it's not enough. So I use that in my garden in the summer because pine needles are like industrial strength in our sun. They can take it. They're designed to do that. They're designed to clobber anything that might compete with the pine tree's resources. But the idea is to get something that is like a tube or like a mesh, a closed-knit mesh like this, so that when the humidity in the air on long drought-filled summers, you know, will actually condense in the cooler area inside the mulch and actually water the plants. In arid environments, 80% of their natural irrigation, 80% of their rainfall, their precipitation, is actually in the form of humidity. Excuse me. So we can take advantage of that here. Even though we get 72 inches of rain, it comes mostly in certain seasons. And we have long periods of time where everything in the world can die, especially if it's not in an ecosystem where you got to open up to the sun. So the idea is to put in these nice deep beds and to mulch with lots of straw and pine straw, because you want to have that condensation happening, especially early in the morning. When you get out there early in the morning, it feels like it's rained. You want most of that to be down in your garden watering your plants.
Now, is your straw clean? Because I've used straw in the Midwest, and you have to be careful because sometimes you're going to have blackberry seeds and weeds growing.
I love that. Yeah, I always want my seeds and weeds to grow.
So what you want. Okay.
Yeah. First of all, ours doesn't. It would be better if it did, because weeds harvest things out of the environment that most cultivars can't, and you just fold it over and put a little bit more hay on it. And that's it. All you're doing is out-competing them, and their roots are down there, and their roots are dying now because you've killed the plant. And now the worms, the microbial life, come in there and eat it all up and love it.
Well, now, do you have like meetings? Okay. 'Cause see, I just joined last week, so I haven't had
Yeah.
time to even read up.
Go out to meetup.com in Permaculture Jacks.
Where I joined.
Yeah, and on the calendar you'll see everything.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we're going to be at Lunchbox. Okay, I work
Yeah.
downtown, right across.
Okay, so I think we're done. I think we're over time by about 15 minutes, and so I appreciate it, guys.
Do you have a question? I just planted my moringa tree. I had it in a pot all winter. It was like this tall. It had all green. I planted it, and now it's all dead on the top. Why did that do that?
And when did you plant it?
Last week. And it's been green as can be and lived all through the winter.
Well, moringa doesn't like too well-developed soil. That's one problem, possibly.
It's kind of just like out, but it isn't. It gets that west sun. Is that too much, you think?
I don't think so. Moringa likes the heat. I don't know.
Usually they die in the winter and come back this time of year.
But she just did it a week ago.
Just a week ago.
I'd say go ahead and just let it sit, see what happens.
I mean, it doesn't have nothing.
A moringa doesn't need to be cut.
Okay.
So, yeah, I would just give it a chance. Just see what happens.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because your moringa's not coming back. My moringa in the ground.
No. They don't come back until it gets nice and hot.
Because that one in the
Mine
pot.
has
came
green
back.
twigs on it.
Yeah, there you go.
Where do you get the goji berries? Where's the source?
We can get them from Tim Armstrong's farm. Eat Your Yard Jacks online.
Okay.
Yeah.
And those take what? Sun, full sun?
That plant lasts through the winter.
Goji berries are like an understory, so I would put them in the shade.
And now I have a Myers lemon I need to plant, and I just don't know where to do it. I do have a southern area where there's nothing. I just use it to put on my stuff. Would that be the place to put it?
Well, when this is over, let's talk about how to prepare the land for your Meyer lemon to kick off in
What I read about goji berries is they don't like the temperature below 50 degrees.
50.
So they-
No, actually, these are going beautifully through the winter.
That's the plant.
Yeah, I don't know. Go to Val and Eli's and check out their goji berries. They're like an understory nightmare.
I bought one from Tim.
I say that in a good way, though. I mean, it's like everywhere you look, goji berries, edible leaves. Fill in the
Edible leaves?
blanks. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned daylilies. Did you know every part of the daylily
Is edible. Yeah. Daylilies are edible.
in it?
Yeah, it's very good too. So see there again, you've got a flower that does a lot of things and it's edible. I mean, come on. It's hard to complain with that.
So there's a house here that has all that stuff.
There's one here that we've started, but we've got projects all over town. We have a network in our community of people growing these kind of gardens. And so the produce levels are starting to go up. And we don't have anybody fruiting. Their trees are, well, let's see. Val and Eli's fruit trees are just now fruiting and mine are just now fruiting. So, yeah, so you're gonna have lots of nice lemons and they're good lemons.
Yeah.
Your variety also, like my plum trees, I've got plums dime size.
Yeah.
But it's